It's July 1518. The streets of Strasbourg are narrow and suffocating in the summer heat. Stone buildings lean close together, blocking out the sun. The smell of human waste and rotting food hangs in the air. And then, without warning, a woman steps into the street and begins to dance. Her name is Frau Trophäa. She's not dancing to music. There is no music. She's not smiling. There's no celebration, no festival, no reason anyone can see. She just dances. Her feet move in jerking, desperate patterns. Her arms flail. Her body twists and spins like she's being controlled by invisible strings. And she doesn't stop. Hours pass. The sun crosses the sky. Frau Trophäa keeps dancing. People gather to watch, confused, then concerned, then horrified. This isn't normal. This isn't anything anyone has seen before. By the time darkness falls, she's still moving, her feet bleeding, her face twisted in exhaustion, and something that looks like terror. What happened in Strasbourg that summer is one of the strangest episodes in recorded history. We have eyewitness accounts, we have city records, we have names and dates and details, and yet, more than 500 years later, we still can't agree on what actually happened or why. Before we go further, if you're finding this helps you drift off, you might like the Sleepy Time History book on prehistoric secrets. It's available at sleepytimehistory.com. Just stories from the deep past told the way you're hearing this now. Anyway, back to 1518. Because Frau Trophäa didn't stop dancing. Not that first night, not the next day. Within a week, dozens more had joined her. Within a month, hundreds of people were dancing in the streets of Strasbourg, unable or unwilling to stop. Some danced until they collapsed. Some danced until their feet were raw and bloody. Some danced until their hearts gave out and they died. This wasn't a party. This wasn't mass hysteria in the way we usually think of it. Some brief shared delusion that fades when people come to their senses. This was sustained, agonizing, and for some, fatal. City officials didn't know what to do. Doctors couldn't explain it. Religious authorities saw demons or divine punishment. And the dancing just kept spreading. The thing that makes the dancing plague of 1518 so unsettling isn't just that it happened. It's that it happened in a world that was, in many ways, recognizably similar to ours. These weren't prehistoric humans living in caves. They were people with jobs and families, living in a real city with laws and churches and municipal records. They wrote things down, they tried to understand, and they failed. So what are we going to do here? We're going to walk through what happened, step by step. We're going to explore the world that produced this nightmare, the Strasbourg of 1518, a city on the edge of collapse. We're going to look at the theories, from poisoned bread to mass psychogenic illness to possibilities we haven't even considered. We're going to examine why this wasn't the only dancing plague in medieval Europe, just the most famous and best documented. And maybe, just maybe, we'll understand something about what it means to be human, about how fragile the line is between order and chaos, about what happens when an entire community loses control. But first, we need to understand where we are. Strasbourg in 1518 wasn't just any city. It was a city in crisis. Strasbourg in 1518 wasn't just one city among many. It was what they called a free imperial city, which sounds grand until you understand what it actually meant. Strasbourg answered directly to the Holy Roman Emperor, not to some local duke or prince. In theory, this gave the city independence and prestige. In practice, it meant complex governance structures, competing power centres, and political tensions that could paralyse decision-making exactly when decisive action was needed most. The city council shared power with various guilds and religious authorities. Nobody could agree on anything. And by July 1518, this fractured leadership was trying to manage a population that was literally starving to death. The crisis had been building for years, not months, years. It started with the winters. 1515 was brutal. The cold came early and stayed late. Crops failed across the Rhine Valley. Then 1516 was worse. Then 1517 brought floods that destroyed what little had survived the previous harvests. By the time summer finally arrived in 1518, the people of Strasbourg had endured 3 consecutive years of agricultural disaster. Grain prices didn't just rise, they exploded. Records from the period show wheat costs increasing by 400% in some markets. For the wealthy, this was painful. For the poor, It was catastrophic. Families that had once gotten by, not comfortably but adequately, found themselves unable to afford bread. The most basic staple of life, the foundation of every meal, became a luxury item, and bread wasn't just food. In the early 16th century, bread was calories, bread was survival, bread was the difference between making it through winter and dying of starvation. When bread became unaffordable, people started eating things that weren't meant to be eaten. Spoiled grain, plants that would normally be fed to animals, anything that might fill the terrible emptiness in their bellies. Malnutrition opened the door for disease. Smallpox tore through the crowded neighbourhoods where the poor lived packed together in buildings that were barely standing. Syphilis, still relatively new to Europe, was spreading rapidly through a population with no immunity and no understanding of how to stop it. The sick couldn't work. Those who couldn't work couldn't earn money. Those without money couldn't buy food. The cycle fed on itself, grinding people down generation by generation, family by family, person by person. Debt became a trap with no escape. People borrowed against future harvests that never materialized. They sold everything they owned, then sold their labor for years in advance, binding themselves to terms that guaranteed they'd never climb out of poverty. Some fled the city entirely, abandoning homes and families to try their luck elsewhere. Others stayed and watched their children grow thin and hollow-eyed. The psychological weight of all this is almost impossible to imagine. Not one crisis, not one bad year. But year after year of compounding disasters with no relief in sight. No reason to believe things would get better. Every season brought fresh catastrophe. Every winter threatened to be the last one your family would see. The stress wasn't acute, it was chronic, grinding, relentless. And Strasbourg was a deeply religious city. These people attended Mass, they prayed, they believed absolutely in divine providence and the reality of sin and punishment. When crops failed and plagues struck and children died, they didn't see random chance. They saw God's judgment. They saw evidence that they had done something terribly wrong, that they were being punished for sins they might not even be aware of. The city's religious character was complicated, officially Catholic but already showing cracks that would soon split open into the Reformation. Martin Luther had posted his theses just months earlier, in October 1517. The ideas were spreading, creating theological debates and religious anxiety that layered on top of everything else. Were the old practices even correct? Was the church itself corrupt? Could salvation even be trusted to the priests and their rituals? Superstition flourished in the gaps where theology couldn't reach. People believed in demons and witches and curses. They believed saints could intervene in daily life. They believed the position of the stars mattered, that certain days were unlucky, that invisible forces shaped their fates in ways they could barely understand. This was the Strasbourg that Frau Troffea stepped into when she began dancing that July morning. A city that had been pushed to the breaking point. A population that had endured years of suffering with no relief. A society where the boundary between the sacred and the terrifying had grown dangerously thin. The stage was set. All it needed was a spark. On or around July 14th, 1518, a woman named Frau Troffea walked into a narrow street in Strasbourg and began to dance. Not at a festival, not at a celebration. There was no music playing, no gathered crowd calling for entertainment. She simply stepped out of her house into the summer heat and started moving. Her feet found rhythm in silence. Her body began to turn and leap and twist in movements that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her control. At first, people probably assumed she was drunk, or mad, or performing some kind of religious penance. Street performances weren't unheard of. People did strange things sometimes, especially in cities as stressed and strange as Strasbourg had become. Maybe this was theatre. Maybe she was making a point about something, protesting in the way that desperate people sometimes do when words fail them. But Frau Troffea didn't stop. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky. The initial curiosity of neighbours turned to concern. Her husband came looking for her, tried to talk to her, tried to get her to come home. She kept dancing. Her movements weren't joyful. Witnesses who recorded what they saw described her face as anguished, contorted in what looked like pain or terror. This wasn't celebration. This was something else, entirely. We know these details because people wrote them down. Physician notes from the period describe her condition. The city council, already overwhelmed with managing the ongoing famine and disease, had to take official notice. Cathedral chapter records mention the event. Later chronicles compiled from contemporary accounts preserve the basic facts, even if they couldn't explain what they meant. Night fell. Frau Trophäa kept dancing. The narrow street where she'd begun must have grown dark, lit only by whatever candles or torches concerned neighbours brought out. You can imagine the scene. The summer air still heavy with heat even after sunset. The sounds of her feet on cobblestones hour after hour. The ragged breathing. The gathering crowd of onlookers, disturbed and fascinated in equal measure. By morning she was still moving. Her feet were bleeding. The simple shoes that 16th-century common folk wore offered almost no protection against the constant impact of dancing on stone streets. The skin broke. Blood made the cobblestones slick. Still she danced. Her face showed the strain. Muscles that weren't meant to work continuously for this long began to fail. But whenever she seemed about to collapse, something drove her back into motion. This was not voluntary. Everyone who witnessed it understood that much. This wasn't a woman choosing to dance. This was a woman being forced to dance by something nobody could see or understand. The distinction mattered. It transformed the event from strange street theatre into something genuinely frightening. The authorities didn't know what to do. What could they do? This wasn't illegal exactly. She wasn't disturbing the peace in any conventional sense. She wasn't attacking anyone. She was just dancing. But the wrongness of it hung over the scene like smoke. People who gathered to watch felt it. Something was deeply broken here. Something had gone terribly wrong in ways that defied their categories and explanations. The second day became a third. Frau Trophäa's condition deteriorated. You can only push a human body so far. Continuous exertion without rest, without food, without water, leads to systematic breakdown. Dehydration, muscle damage, cardiovascular strain. The body consumes itself looking for energy to continue, but still she danced, and then other people started joining her, not immediately, not all at once. But within days of Frau Trophäa's first steps, other Strasbourg residents began displaying the same compulsive dancing. They would be going about their normal business, trying to survive another day of hunger and heat and hopelessness, and suddenly their feet would begin moving. The rhythm would take them. The dance would possess them exactly as it had possessed Trophäa. By the end of the first week, approximately 34 people were dancing. 34 individuals who couldn't stop moving, couldn't rest, couldn't escape whatever force had gripped their bodies and made them instruments of a dance they hadn't chosen. The narrow streets of Strasbourg's poorest quarters filled with dancers who looked like they were being tortured. Faces twisted in exhaustion and pain. Feet bleeding. Bodies pushed far past any reasonable limit. The sound must have been incredible. Dozens of feet hitting stone. Ragged breathing. Occasional cries or moans. The summer heat made everything worse. July in Strasbourg could be brutal. No shade in those narrow medieval streets. The sun beating down on dancers who couldn't seek shelter. Sweat-soaked clothing. The smell of unwashed bodies pushed to extremes. Crowds gathered. How could they not? This was unlike anything anyone had seen. Even in a city that had witnessed years of disaster, this was new. This was inexplicable. People watched with mounting horror as their neighbours, their friends, sometimes their family members joined the growing company of dancers. Trying to physically restrain them didn't work. The dancers would fight against restraint with desperate strength, would return to dancing the moment they were released. The city's fractured authorities began arguing about what should be done. Religious leaders saw demonic possession or divine punishment. Physicians saw a medical condition they couldn't diagnose. City councillors saw a public order problem that was rapidly spiralling beyond their control. Everyone had theories, nobody had solutions, and the dancing continued. The summer heat pressed down. The dancers spun and leaped and suffered in the streets, and Strasbourg, already pushed to its limits, had to confront the possibility that something impossible was happening within its walls. The plague was just beginning. Within a month, the number had exploded to somewhere around 400 dancers. 400. Let that number settle for a moment. This wasn't a handful of disturbed individuals anymore. This wasn't something the city could isolate or contain or dismiss as isolated incidents of madness. 400 people, all seized by the same compulsive movement, all trapped in the same inexplicable dance that wouldn't let them rest. Now we need to be careful with that number. 400 comes from later chronicles compiled years after the events. Some contemporary records suggest slightly lower figures. Others imply the number might have been even higher at the peak. Medieval record-keeping wasn't precise, especially during crises when the people who normally kept records were overwhelmed just trying to manage immediate disasters. But every source from the period agrees on the basic scale. This was massive. This involved hundreds of people, and the documentation supporting that scale comes from multiple independent sources. Physician notes describing treatments attempted on dozens of patients simultaneously. City council records allocating resources to deal with the crisis. Cathedral chapter accounts discussing the theological implications. Chronicles written by people who witnessed the events firsthand. They all tell the same essential story. The dancing spread like contagion through Strasbourg's population, and it spread fast. The victims came from everywhere, not just one neighbourhood or one social class, men and women both, though some records suggest women may have been disproportionately affected. Rich and poor, though the evidence suggests most dancers came from the struggling lower classes, the people who had been hit hardest by the famine and disease, young and old, married and single, people with families, people living alone. There was no clear pattern. No obvious connection between the dancers beyond their shared residence in a city that had pushed them all to their limits. What witnesses recorded is almost unbearable to imagine. People dancing until their bodies simply gave out. Collapsing in the streets from exhaustion so profound their hearts stopped. Suffering strokes as the prolonged exertion pushed their cardiovascular systems past breaking points. Contemporary physicians documented cases of dancers dying in the streets, their bodies finally failing after days of continuous movement. The details that survive are specific and disturbing. Dancers whose feet had worn through the skin entirely, leaving bloody footprints on the cobblestones. People who had danced until the bones in their feet cracked from repeated impact. Individuals who screamed in pain even as their legs kept moving, kept forcing them through the steps of a dance they couldn't escape. Many appeared to be in trance states. Their eyes were open but unfocused, looking at something nobody else could see. When people tried to speak to them, the dancers often didn't respond. Or they would respond but seemed confused, disoriented, as if they were experiencing reality through some distorting filter that separated them from everyone around them. Some dancers begged for help. These accounts are particularly heartbreaking. People crying out for someone to make it stop, pleading with observers to do something, anything, to end the compulsion that held them. Their mouths formed words of desperation even as their bodies continued the relentless movement. They were aware enough to know what was happening to them, aware enough to be terrified, but not aware enough or in sufficient control to simply stop. Others seemed completely unreachable. These dancers moved as if possessed by something that had taken complete control of their bodies and locked their minds away somewhere inaccessible. People who knew them would call their names, grab their shoulders, try to break through whatever barrier separated the dancers from normal consciousness. Nothing worked. The dancers would stare through them, or past them, or at them without recognition, and keep dancing. The variety of presentation suggests this wasn't one simple phenomenon. Different people seemed to experience the dancing differently, even as they were all trapped in the same basic compulsion. Some remained partially aware. Others disappeared entirely into the dance. Some fought against it constantly. Others seemed to surrender to it, letting their bodies do whatever the invisible force demanded. City authorities were documenting everything as best they could under impossible circumstances. They needed to understand what was happening, needed to find patterns that might suggest causes or cures. But the documentation also reveals their growing panic. These were officials trained to handle conventional problems: crime, disease, economic disruption, resource allocation during famine. They had procedures for those situations, categories, established responses. This fit none of their categories. This was people dancing themselves to death in the streets, and nothing in the administrative handbook covered dancing plagues. The records show them grasping for explanations, cycling through possibilities, rejecting theories as quickly as they formed them, because nothing quite fit what they were witnessing. The numbers kept climbing. Every day brought new dancers. People who had seemed fine the previous evening would wake up with the compulsion, or it would hit them in the middle of the day, their bodies suddenly seized by the need to move. They would try to resist at first. Most of them did. You can imagine the desperate internal struggle, feet beginning to tap against their will, muscles starting to twitch with rhythms that shouldn't be there. The horrible moment of realization that whatever had taken the others was now taking them too, and then they would be in the streets with the rest, adding their footfalls to the terrible percussion of hundreds of feet on stone. The sound echoed through Strasbourg's narrow passages. You couldn't escape it. Even if you closed your windows and doors, the sound penetrated. The city's acoustic geography channeled it, amplified it, made sure everyone heard the constant reminder that something impossible was consuming their neighbours. The scale made everything worse. 30 people dancing in the streets was disturbing. 400 was apocalyptic. This felt like the end of something, like reality itself had broken down in Strasbourg, and the normal rules governing human behaviour and bodily control no longer applied. If 400 people could be forced to dance against their will until they died, what other impossible horrors might be waiting just around the corner? The city was running out of time to find answers, because the dancers were running out of time to survive, and the authorities were about to make a decision that would transform the crisis from catastrophic to legendary. The people in charge had to do something. They couldn't just stand in the Guildhall and listen to the endless thud of feet on stone, watch the numbers climb in their ledgers, and shrug. Strasbourg was a major city of the Holy Roman Empire. It had a sophisticated administration for its time, a city council, committees, legal experts, physicians, clerics, wealthy guildmasters who prided themselves on being rational, organised men, so they assembled. The council minutes from that summer show the shape of their anxiety beneath the formal language. Petitions, complaints, reports from the streets. Physicians called in to offer opinions. Clergy consulted about the spiritual implications. Everyone talking, arguing, trying to make sense of a situation that made no sense. But when you don't understand something, you reach for the frameworks you do have. In early 16th-century Europe, that framework was humoral medicine. Galen, the ancient physician whose theories still dominated medical thinking more than 1,000 years after his death, divided the body into 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health meant balance, illness meant imbalance. Too much of one humour, not enough of another. Every symptom, every behaviour could be slotted into that system. The Strasbourg physicians examined the dancers and concluded they were suffering from an excess of blood. They were overheated. Their blood was too hot, too active, surging through the body and driving it into this frantic motion. The dancers' flushed faces, sweating skin, wild movements, all of it looked like classic signs of a sanguine excess. They called it hot blood. To a modern mind, that sounds almost poetic. To them, it was a technical diagnosis, a clear category, and once they had a category, they could choose a treatment. If excess heat was the problem, the solution was to draw the heat out. To let the body exhaust itself, expel the excess humour, and reset to equilibrium. You didn't always cool something by forcing it to rest. Sometimes, according to humoral logic, you let the hot element burn itself out. So the physicians advised the council, let them dance, not just let them, help them. If you imagine a room full of counsellors, some of them probably found that recommendation horrifying. Others would have been relieved. Here was a proposed solution that didn't require admitting the city was cursed or possessed. No need yet to declare an official miracle or demonic attack. This was still in the realm of natural philosophy, the respectable science of the age. The council chose to trust their doctors. In a decision that would echo down the centuries, Strasbourg's authorities decided to cure the dancing by giving it structure. They ordered a wooden platform constructed in one of the main public spaces, a proper stage, something strong enough to hold dozens of frenzied bodies. They hired musicians, pipers, drummers, fiddlers, and paid them from city funds. Some sources even mention bringing in professional dancers, people trained to move for long periods, perhaps to guide or channel the movements of the afflicted. Think about that for a moment. Hundreds of people were already dancing uncontrollably, their bodies breaking down from exhaustion, and the official response was to build them a stage and give them a soundtrack. This wasn't cruelty in their minds. It was treatment. It was humane. You couldn't just drag these people into dark rooms and tie them down. That would have been seen as dangerous, even potentially deadly. Letting them dance under supervision, with proper music, on a safer surface than rough cobblestones, This seemed compassionate, modern-sounding even, public health as organised entertainment. And for a brief moment it's possible some people believed it was working. The stage would have gathered dancers into a central area where they could be watched. The music might have smoothed the chaotic frenzy into something that at least looked like rhythm. On paper, the city had turned an uncontrollable crisis into an organised festival of healing. But the human mind is rarely that cooperative, because once the stage went up and the music began, something else happened. Something no one on the council appears to have anticipated. Spectators gathered. Of course they did. Strasbourg was already a tense, hungry, frightened city. Any event became a spectacle, a distraction. Now there was a dedicated platform, hired musicians, and a crowd of people moving in ways that seemed strange, frightening, compelling. People came to watch, to pray, to gossip, to stare. And in that crowd were individuals who had been sleeping badly for months, who had lost children to disease, who were behind on taxes, who had gone hungry all spring, who had whispered to their neighbours that maybe God was angry, that maybe the city had done something terribly wrong. They stood at the edges of the makeshift dance floor, hearts racing, breathing shallow, watching bodies fling themselves through space, watching people whose minds looked just slightly out of phase with reality. The music hammered at their ears. Feet pounded the stage. Dust rose. Prayers mixed with shouts and sobs. Some of those spectators started to feel strange. The chroniclers don't give us psychological detail, but modern readers can imagine it. The anxiety of seeing your neighbours trapped in a horror you don't understand. The fear that it might happen to you. The way your brain, primed by constant stress and religious expectation, begins to interpret every twitch, every stray thought, as a sign. And then, for a certain number of people, the line between watcher and participant simply vanished. They stepped forward. Their feet started moving. Their bodies joined the rhythm. The dance took them, as it had taken the others. The city's cure had become a recruitment mechanism. The sources are clear that the crisis intensified after the authorities began encouraging the dancing. More people joined. The spectacle escalated. What had been scattered outbreaks across neighbourhoods coalesced into a terrifying, city-sanctioned public ritual of exhaustion. From the council's perspective, this must have felt like betrayal by reality itself. They had followed the best medical advice available. They had acted decisively, invested resources, mobilised craftsmen and musicians, and the numbers kept rising. At some point, the records don't give us a precise day, the mood in the council chambers shifted. The confidence that this was a treatable natural illness began to erode. The term hot blood started to seem too simple, too neat, because instead of burning out, the fire was spreading. So the city reversed course, the musicians were dismissed, payment records simply stop. The stage, once a symbol of therapeutic order, was shut down. Some accounts say it was dismantled, others that it was simply barred from use. Public dancing, which had been officially encouraged as a cure, was now prohibited. You can almost feel the emotional whiplash. Yesterday the message was, come, dance it out, let the doctors help you. Today the message was, stop, go home, this is dangerous, this is no longer allowed. But banning the visible symptom didn't answer the deeper question. What was this? If humoral medicine had failed, there was only one major explanatory system left that people trusted: the spiritual. As confidence in the natural remedy collapsed, the authorities began to listen more closely to the clergy and the popular stories circulating among the laity. Reports had already been spreading that some of the dancers claimed to be cursed, that they saw visions, that they believed themselves under the power of a saint known to punish the sinful with involuntary movement. And one name came up again and again in the local religious imagination: St. Vitus. The council's next decision would mark a turning point in the entire episode, a move away from trying to treat the dancers as patients and toward treating them as pilgrims, away from the city and its failed stage, toward a mountaintop shrine where the problem of the dance would be handed over to a very different kind of authority. St. Vitus had been dead for more than 1,000 years by the time the first dancer stepped into the streets of Strasbourg. According to Christian tradition, he'd been a boy in the early 4th century, somewhere in the eastern reaches of the Roman Empire, a child martyr under the persecutions of Diocletian. One of those saints whose biographies are more legend than history, filled with miraculous healings, confrontations with pagan authorities, and an unwavering faith that ends with torture and execution. But the bare bones are simple. Vitus refused to renounce his Christianity. He was arrested, tortured, and eventually killed. In the centuries that followed, his cult grew. Relics were carried from place to place. Churches were dedicated in his name. Stories accumulated around him. Stories of protection. Stories of punishment. By the late Middle Ages, in the lands along the Rhine and beyond, he had taken on a very specific role in the religious imagination. St. Vitus became the patron of those who could not control their own movements. Convulsions, tremors, seizures, jerking limbs, strange involuntary dances, anything that made the body move without the person's apparent consent could fall under his domain. In German there was even a phrase for it, Sankt Vitus Tanz, St. Vitus's dance, a label that centuries later would be borrowed by physicians for certain neurological disorders. To modern ears, that might sound like a metaphor. For people in 16th century Strasbourg, it was a living category of experience, a way they already understood the world before Frau Trophea ever took her first step. If you lived in that region, you had heard stories of people on the road to the shrine who suddenly began to twitch and whirl as if an invisible hand had seized their joints, stories of groups struck by a strange dancing affliction until they made a vow to St. Vitus, or until a priest anointed them in his name, stories of families who had offended the saint by breaking a vow, by mocking a procession, by neglecting his feast, and whose children then developed uncontrollable movements. In this universe of meaning, saints weren't only gentle intercessors, hovering like kindly grandparents over the faithful. They were powerful patrons with tempers. In popular piety, a saint could be offended. A saint could withhold protection. A saint could, in some cases, actively punish. This wasn't seen as cruel. It was moral logic projected onto the supernatural. If you thought of God as a just ruler, you thought of saints as his local magistrates. They rewarded obedience. They disciplined disobedience. They defended their honour. They could be turned to in crisis, but they could also be the source of the crisis if someone, somewhere, had broken the unwritten contract of devotion and respect. So when Strasbourg's medical framework faltered, when hot blood no longer felt like an adequate explanation for men and women collapsing in the streets with bloody feet and haunted eyes, minds turned instinctively toward that other framework, the spiritual one, in which a saint's wrath was as real as summer heat. Chroniclers tell us that by late July and August, more and more of the afflicted were saying it outright. They believed themselves to be under St. Vitus's curse. Some claimed to see him in visions. Others said that certain movements, certain twisting, stamping gestures, were happening because the saint compelled them. We can't know how literally they meant this, whether they truly saw a figure or whether they were reaching for the only language that fit their experience. But in a city saturated with his reputation, the association felt natural enough that the council took it seriously. If the doctors could not cure the dancers, perhaps the saint who had cursed them could. Outside the city, on a rise known as Hohenstein, there was a shrine dedicated to St. Vitus. It wasn't a grand pilgrimage centre on the scale of Rome or Santiago, but it was known, a place of local devotion, a spot people visited when they had strange ailments, convulsions, or fears of enchantment. The council decided that the dancers should be taken there. The language of the records shifts. No longer patients to be managed within the city walls, they became pilgrims to be escorted to a holy place. The authorities arranged transport. Some of the weakest were carried on wagons. Others stumbled along the road, still jerking and swaying, surrounded by attendants and clergy. At Hohenstein, a ritual awaited them. The chroniclers describe it with a few stark details, and those details are telling. The dancers were brought into the shrine and anointed with holy oil. They were given shoes, not just any shoes, but red ones, and led in a circuit around a wooden image of St. Vitus. Imagine that scene, but not as spectacle, as therapy in the language of the time. Holy oil was a standard tool in late medieval Christianity, used in sacraments, used in blessings, used in healing. To have oil traced on your forehead, on your chest, on your limbs, was to be marked as someone under divine attention. The priest would have prayed as they anointed, asking Vitus to break the curse, to redirect his power from punishment to protection. The red shoes are stranger to us because their symbolism isn't spelled out in the texts. But colour was rarely accidental in medieval ritual. Red could mean blood, passion, life, the Holy Spirit. It could also mean danger, fire, the intense presence of the sacred. Putting the afflicted into red shoes might have been a way of marking them out as people in a special liminal state, neither simply sick nor simply well, undergoing something, passing through something. Shoes themselves mattered too. Feet were how you touch the world. In many traditions, new shoes for a pilgrimage signalled a new start, a step away from the sin or misfortune that had brought you to the shrine. Giving dancers who could not stop moving a fresh pair of shoes, blessed and coloured, could be read as a symbolic reset, a way of saying, walk differently now, move differently now, move under the saint's guidance, not against it. Then there was the circling, led around a wooden effigy of St. Vitus, not once but repeatedly. The dancers' chaotic movements were folded into a controlled ritual motion. The uncontrolled dance of the streets was transformed into a deliberate procession, a movement with a centre, with a focus, with an object of devotion at its heart. Around and around they went, red shoes scuffing the floor, crosses traced in the air, prayers muttered, chanted or whispered under strained breath. To the people performing and witnessing this, it wasn't just empty choreography, it was negotiation. The saint had, in their understanding, shown his displeasure by unleashing an affliction that made bodies move against their will. The community now responded by presenting those same bodies back to him in an act of humility and supplication. Look, the ritual said, we acknowledge your power, we recognize your shrine, we honor your image, now please withdraw your hand. Modern historians can analyze this in psychological terms. The ritual channeled terror into order. It offered a script, a set of actions to people whose lives had spun off the rails. It gave them something to do, a story in which they were not just victims of random misfiring nerves or collective panic, but participants in a meaningful drama between heaven and earth. For those who believed, that meaning alone could have been a kind of medicine. We don't have neat statistics about what happened next. No table listing exactly how many dancers improved after a visit to Hohenstein, how many relapsed, how many never made it back. The sources are patchy, anecdotal, written with more interest in moral lessons than epidemiological precision. But we do know this. By early September, the great wave of dancing in Strasbourg had ebbed. The city records grow quieter. The complaints taper off. Later writers, looking back, often credit the shrine visits. In their telling, St. Vitus, once appeased, allowed the afflicted to return to normal life. The curse was lifted. The dance subsided. From a modern perspective, the timeline is murky. The episode might have been naturally burning itself out, the way psychological contagions often do, just as the pilgrimages were organised. The exhaustion, injuries, and sheer passage of time might have broken the cycle regardless. Or perhaps the powerful symbolism and communal focus of the ritual truly did help many dancers find a way to stop. We can't disentangle those threads with certainty. What we can say is that, in the minds of the people who lived through it, the story ended not with a medical cure, but with a saint. St. Vitus, whose name had become synonymous with convulsive movement, had been both the imagined source of the horror and its hoped-for remedy. His shrine on Hohenstein stands at the hinge of the narrative, where Strasbourg turned from stages and musicians to oil and red shoes, from the city square to the wooden image on a hill. And the strangest part is that, for many, this pattern would have felt familiar. Because this was not the first time people in Europe had turned to St. Vitus, when bodies began to dance beyond their control, nor would it be the last. This was not a new story, dropped suddenly into the world in the heat of 1518. It was an old story, already worn smooth by retelling. A pattern that had surfaced again and again along the rivers and roads of Central Europe, long before Strasbourg's councillors found themselves staring out at a square full of swaying bodies. If you trace the chronicles backward, following the hints and fragments, you start to see it. The summer of 1518 was dramatic, but it wasn't the first time an entire community had found its feet moving in ways no one could fully explain. Nearly a century and a half earlier, in 1374, the city of Aachen, in what is now Western Germany, close to the borders of Belgium and the Netherlands, experienced something eerily familiar. Chroniclers describe that year as one of chaos. Not just political trouble or local feuds, but something stranger. Groups of people, sometimes dozens at a time, began to move through the streets in an uncontrollable dance. They leapt. They spun. They shouted. They cried out for help. They were not performers. They were not celebrating a festival. They were, in the words of one near-contemporary account, people seized by a strange frenzy, who danced day and night until they collapsed in exhaustion. The descriptions echo Strasbourg almost point for point. The dancers are said to have complained of visions. Some claim to see the heavens open, or the ground swell beneath them like waves. Others begged onlookers to hold them down to stop their limbs from jerking. They couldn't. The episode in Aachen did not stay in Aachen. Like a fire that finds dry brush, it spread, along the Rhine corridor and its tributaries, to Cologne, to Liège, to smaller towns whose names now appear only as brief entries in medieval annals. The pattern is unsettlingly familiar. A group begins to dance in one town. Word spreads. A few days or weeks later, a similar outbreak is reported downriver or along a trade route. Chroniclers note crowds gathering to watch, clergy attempting exorcisms, authorities debating how to respond. In some places, bells were rung in procession. In others, sufferers were led to chapels dedicated to St. Vitus or to other saints associated with healing and protection. Priests said masses. Relics were carried through the streets. The afflicted were encircled by prayers instead of by curious neighbours. And just as in Strasbourg, the phenomenon flickered and faded. It would burn intensely for a time, then taper off, leaving behind confusion, moralizing sermons, and a handful of carefully written lines in Latin or Middle High German. By the time Frau Trophäa stepped into the street in 1518, those older stories were part of the mental furniture of the region. People had heard of the dance manias of the previous century. They had heard the phrase St. Vitus's dance before it ever applied to them. And if you keep going back, the trail does not end with 1374 either. Further up the river and further back in time lie other smaller tales. In the early 11th century, in the year 1017, a chronicle from the region of Saxony tells a curious story about the village of Kilbourne. According to this account, it was Christmas Eve. The villagers gathered outside the church, but instead of joining the solemn service, a group began to dance in the churchyard. They danced boisterously, the chronicler says, disturbing the worship inside. The local priest demanded they stop. They refused. Some even mocked him. So the priest, in the logic of the story, pronounced a curse, not a casual one, a formal one. He called on God to punish their irreverence, to make their uncontrolled dance into a lasting sign. The tale then takes on a sharply supernatural tone. The dancers, we are told, were immediately struck with an inability to stop. They continued to dance, not for minutes or hours, but for days, then months. 12 months, according to one version. Bound together, clutching each other's hands, they stamped and turned without rest. Their feet bled, their clothes shredded, their families begged the priest to lift the curse. Eventually, after a year, the spell was broken, but the dancers were left with lasting tremors, or fell into a deep, unnatural sleep from which some never awoke. Modern historians read this story with caution. It comes to us already wrapped in moral symbolism, clearly meant to warn listeners against disrespecting sacred space. The timescale is probably exaggerated. The supernatural elements, a year of continuous dancing, push it toward legend. And yet, beneath the layers of miracle and punishment, the shape is familiar. A group dance that becomes involuntary. A community that watches, horrified and fascinated. A religious framework that turns inexplicable movement into a narrative about sin and retribution. Kilbourne is not unique. There are scattered references in 11th and 12th century texts to people suddenly seized by a dance fever, near churches or shrines. They are brief, sometimes only a line or two, enough to suggest that later outbreaks were not entirely unprecedented. When you lay all these episodes side by side, Kilbourne in 1017, the scattered medieval anecdotes, Aachen and its neighbours in 1374, Strasbourg in 1518, another pattern emerges: geography. Most of the best documented cases cluster in a rough band, along the Rhine and its major tributaries, and in the regions that now make up western Germany, eastern Belgium, Luxembourg, and parts of the Netherlands and northeastern France. This was not an empty backwater. It was one of medieval Europe's major corridors of trade and communication. Goods, ideas, rumours, and religious devotions moved along the river with almost equal ease. It was also a region where certain saints, certain expectations, and certain fears had particular power. St. Vitus was especially venerated here. So were other holy figures associated with healing convulsions, epilepsy, and strange movements. Pilgrimage shrines dotted the landscape. Processions, vows, and miracle tales were woven into the yearly rhythm of life. In such an environment, when something odd happened to the body, it rarely remained a purely private experience. It was almost automatically drawn into a public, shared framework of meaning. An uncontrollable shiver, a tremor, a twitch that spread from one person to another. These were not just medical curiosities. They were potential signs, warnings, punishments, or for some, invitations to participate in a drama larger than themselves. The earlier outbreaks, scattered across centuries, tell us something crucial about the cultural soil in which Strasbourg's dancing plague took root. They show that people in this region already had a repertoire of stories about cursed dancers, saintly wrath, and miraculous cures. The idea that bodies could be seized by a collective, uncontrollable dance was not an invention of 1518. It was a possibility that existed in the imagination long before that particular summer. And imagination matters. When historians talk about mass psychogenic illness or collective behaviour, they are not imagining a blank slate. People do not invent their symptoms from nothing. They reach, often unconsciously, for forms their culture has already made available. If you live in a world where there is no story about cursed dancers, where no one has ever heard of St. Vitus's dance, a sudden surge of anxiety might manifest as fainting, or as muteness, or as trembling. In the late medieval Rhineland, it could just as easily manifest as a dance. The disappearance of these outbreaks from European history after the 16th century is therefore as revealing as their presence. After Strasbourg, there are still occasional references to individuals with St. Vitus's dance, but the great communal episodes, crowds of people dancing in the streets for days on end, fade from the record. They do not vanish with a bang, but with a quiet dwindling. Something in the cultural ecosystem changed. Reformations, Protestant and Catholic alike, reshaped religious life. Many shrines were closed, their relics removed, their stories suppressed or reframed. Devotions to saints associated with convulsions and curses were discouraged in some regions, reshaped in others. At the same time, emerging medical ideas began to claim more authority over strange bodily phenomena. Conditions once slotted effortlessly into a spiritual framework were gradually relabeled as nervous disorders, melancholic tempers, or diseases of the brain. In other words, the script changed. The river valleys were still there. The people were still there. The stresses of famine, war, and plague certainly did not go away. But the particular story that had once turned fear and suffering into a contagious dance, that specific way of making sense of involuntary movement, lost some of its power. Without that shared narrative, full-scale dancing manias no longer found fertile ground. So the outbreaks receded into memory, into chronicles, into cautionary tales and local legends. The phrase, St. Vitus's dance, migrated into medical texts, far from the streets and shrines where it had once lived. By the time modern neurology began using it to describe chorea and other movement disorders, the original meaning, the image of entire communities beating their feet bloody under an invisible compulsion, was already fading into the shadows of history. But if you listen closely to those old accounts, Aachen, Kilbourne, Strasbourg, you can still hear it. The echo of a time when belief, fear and suffering could combine in such a way that an entire town might find itself moving to a rhythm no one had consciously chosen. And that echo is what makes the search for explanations so haunting. Once you know that story, the river valleys, the saints, the curses and processions, one of the first modern explanations people reach for feels almost disappointingly simple. Maybe they say it wasn't saints at all. Maybe it was bread. More specifically, a fungus that lives on bread's raw material. Along the damp edges of fields, on the waving heads of rye, there is a parasite with an almost theatrical talent for mischief. Claviceps purpurea. Farmers in northern Europe have known it for centuries, even if they didn't have a Latin name for it. Instead of a clean, golden rye grain, you sometimes find a swollen, dark, purple-black growth, like a tiny burnt horn, fused to the ear of the plant. That horn is ergot. Inside it is a cocktail of alkaloids, chemical compounds, that in modern times would become famous for an odd reason. When chemists began investigating ergot in the 20th century, one of them, working at a Swiss pharmaceutical company, modified one of its molecules. He called it LSD-25. The experiment was filed away as unpromising, until a few years later, by accident, the chemist absorbed a tiny amount through his skin. The result was an intense, disorienting psychedelic experience. He had, without meaning to, discovered lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. The connection is not perfect, but it is close enough that you can draw a straight line in your mind, from purple growths on medieval rye to visions to the modern era's most famous hallucinogen. Long before anyone knew what an alkaloid was, people knew what happened when you ate ergot in sufficient quantities. Your limbs could begin to twitch or convulse. Your fingers and toes might burn or go numb. Some sufferers reported strange visions, flashes of light, distorted shapes, terrifying apparitions. In severe cases, it could be much worse. Ergot constricts blood vessels, starves tissues, hands and feet might blacken. Sometimes entire limbs would die, becoming gangrenous, and eventually fall away. The pain and burning was so intense that medieval chroniclers reached instinctively for religious imagery. They called it St. Anthony's Fire. Hospitals dedicated to St. Anthony, run by a brotherhood known as the Antonites, specialized in treating people afflicted by this terrifying illness. Pilgrims came with bandaged hands, necrotic feet, ulcerated skin. They prayed beneath images of the saint while surgeons tried to cut away dead flesh and save what remained. When modern researchers looked back at those descriptions and at the chemistry of ergot, they began to wonder, could a more moderate convulsive form of ergotism, not the full devastating gangrenous type, have been behind some of the medieval dance fevers? Could Strasbourg's dancers have been, quite literally, poisoned by their bread? In some ways, the idea fits with unnerving neatness. Think back to Strasbourg in 1518. Failed harvests, rising grain prices, desperate people clinging to any source of food they could find. Quality control was not their first concern. If the choice is between hunger and a sack of rye with a few suspicious dark kernels, hunger often loses. Ergot thrives in exactly the kind of cool, damp conditions that can follow bad weather. It targets rye, which was a common grain for poorer communities along the Rhine. It does not announce itself with a smell. Ground into flour and baked into loaves, it can disappear into the daily staple of life. If a region already struggling with famine began milling contaminated grain into bread, the exposure would not be rare or isolated. Whole neighbourhoods could be ingesting small doses day after day. From this angle, the picture sharpens. A hot summer, stressed bodies, malnourished nervous systems, and a hidden chemical irritant lace through the very food that is supposed to sustain you. You can almost see the documentary storyboard writing itself. Convulsions? Check. Hallucinations? Check. Medieval chroniclers describing frenzy and visions? Check. A historical illness literally called St. Anthony's Fire, in an age when saints were already part of the vocabulary for strange bodily events. For a time, this ergot theory became a favourite. It seemed to offer what modern minds often crave, a clean, biochemical cause. No need for saints. No need for complex webs of belief and social contagion. Just fungus. But when historians and physicians began to press the theory more closely against the details of what actually happened in Strasbourg, the tidy edges started to fray. First, the nature of ergotism itself. There are broadly two classic forms described in the medical literature. The gangrenous form, with burning and blackening limbs, and the convulsive form, with spasms, seizures, and sometimes mental disturbances. Neither looks much like what the Strasbourg records describe. People moving more or less continuously for days, sometimes weeks, in patterns others recognized as dancing. Ergot's constricting effect on blood vessels doesn't just hurt. It robs muscles of oxygen. It weakens them. Victims of severe ergotism could barely stand. Some couldn't feel their feet at all. Others collapsed in pain. Limbs seized stiffly or jerked in short, violent spasms. This is not the kind of movement you can sustain hour after hour. John Waller, one of the historians who has spent the most time with Strasbourg's archive, has been particularly blunt on this point. Ergotism, he argues, is disabling, crippling. It pins people to beds and stretches them on the ground. It does not send them marching, more or less upright, through a city square under the summer sun. Even milder exposures tend to produce irregular, jagged symptoms, bouts of stomach pain, tingling, tremors, strange dreams. Not the coordinated, oddly patterned dance that observers in 1518 felt compelled to name and describe as such. Then there is the question of duration and selectivity. If the bread was contaminated, it would not have chosen its victims neatly. People across the city would have been ingesting roughly similar amounts. You would expect a broad swathe of the population to show signs of poisoning: children, elders, bakers, priests. Instead, what the surviving reports describe is a relatively focused group who begin, quite literally, in the street. Frau Trophea, and then those who joined or followed her, did not rise from their beds clutching at burning limbs. They stepped out into public space and moved there in sight of others, as if the setting itself were part of the affliction. Ergotism, by contrast, does not care about performance. It strikes in kitchens and in fields, in monasteries and in barns. It does not cluster around shrines in ways that neatly echo earlier tales of cursed dancers and St. Vitus. And then there is another subtler issue: timing. The 1518 outbreak takes place in high summer. Ergot infects rye in the field, but the most dangerous levels of contamination tend to emerge in stored grain that has had time to sit in damp conditions. Many of the worst historical ergotism outbreaks seem to have been associated with winter and early spring, when people were relying on old stores. This is not a rigid rule, but it adds another small weight to the scale. One by one, the neat correspondences between ergot and the dancing plague begin to look less like a tight causal chain and more like a set of atmospheric overlaps. Similar region, similar staple crop, similar background hardships, without a precise match. Waller and others have therefore suggested something more cautious. Could ergot have been present in Strasbourg? Very likely. It was common in the region. Poor harvests and desperate milling practices almost guarantee that some of the city's bread that year contained at least a few toxic kernels. Could low-level ergot exposure, combining with malnutrition and stress, have left people more physically fragile, more prone to dizziness, tremors, or strange sensations? Quite possibly. But as a sole explanation for dozens, perhaps hundreds of people dancing in coordinated fashion for days on end, it struggles. It does not account for the way the behaviour spread along social lines rather than strictly dietary ones. It does not fully explain why this eruption of movement took on the specific shape of a well-known religious drama, St. Vitus's dance, rather than the raw, chaotic spasms of poisoning. In the end, the ergot theory tells us something important, but not in the way its early advocates hoped. It reminds us that medieval Europeans were not living in a clean, chemically neutral world. Their bread sometimes carried hidden dangers. Their bodies were buffeted not only by famine and fear and belief, but by invisible molecules that modern science can name and measure. Yet, when you set those molecules beside the chronicles, what emerges is not a simple story of toxins causing madness, but a more layered picture. Poison may have weakened bodies. Hunger may have frayed nerves, but something else was needed to turn that raw vulnerability into a contagious dance that echoed stories already centuries old. To find that something else, you have to look beyond the grain fields and into the mind, and into the shared imagination of a city on edge. There is a modern name for that something else: mass psychogenic illness. Once people called it mass hysteria, usually with a curl of the lip, as if it were nothing more than silliness or attention-seeking. The newer term is less judgmental and more accurate, because whatever is happening in these outbreaks, it is not pretend. In mass psychogenic illness, real distress in the mind produces real symptoms in the body, and those symptoms spread through a group, not by germs or toxins, but by perception, by expectation, by fear. Imagine a school where one girl suddenly collapses in assembly. She feels dizzy, her heart is pounding, she can't catch her breath. Teachers rush to her aid. Her classmates watch, anxious, whispering. A few minutes later, another student sways and sinks to the floor. Someone else starts to hyperventilate. Within an hour, half a dozen students have been carried to the nurse's office. Doctors test the air. They test the water. They look for gas leaks, strange chemicals, anything that could be making children faint. Again and again, they find nothing. What they do find, when they look more closely, is a pattern they now know well. A vulnerable group, already under pressure, exam stress, social tensions, strict rules, a frightening episode in public. The sudden, alarming idea that there is something in the air, or something is wrong with our bodies. And then, within that charged atmosphere, one person's symptoms become a kind of template. The mind, exquisitely tuned to danger, begins scanning the body for any sign that matches the threat it expects. A flutter in the chest, a moment of light-headedness, a tingle in the fingers. Sensations everyone has from time to time, usually ignored, now leap into focus. I feel it too. The more people say it, the more others start to notice their own versions. The result is a wave of entirely genuine fainting, trembling, nausea, paralysis, coughs, you name it, without any physical toxin to blame. This is the basic architecture of mass psychogenic illness. A triggering event, a community under strain, a shared belief about what is happening, and bodies that, without conscious fakery, begin to enact that belief. Historian John Waller thinks Strasbourg in 1518 fits this pattern almost eerily well. In his reading, the dancing plague was not a case of poisoning, but of what he calls a stress-induced psychosis, or trance, made vastly more potent by the cultural world people lived inside. To modern ears, that word psychogenic can sound like imaginary. For Waller, it is anything but. In extreme states, belief does not float above the body like a ghost. It tunnels into muscle, sinew, heartbeat, posture. It rewires the way movement and awareness connect. So walk back into Strasbourg with that in mind. You have a city pressed by famine, disease, debt, and fear of divine anger. You have stories, centuries old, of St. Vitus, a figure associated with uncontrollable movement, cursing people to dance until their feet bled, sometimes until they dropped dead from exhaustion. You have shrines and images reinforcing that story, and processions that ritually reenact it. If you truly believe that such a curse is not just possible, but looming over you, what does that do to the way your mind listens to your own body? Step 1. Anxiety sharpens every sensation. Step 2. Someone cracks. In Waller's reconstruction, Frau Trofea becomes the first visible template. Perhaps she was carrying unbearable private grief. Perhaps she had a pre-existing vulnerability to dissociation, that strange protective state where parts of the mind go offline and behaviour unspools without the usual sense of voluntary control. Under enough strain, and filled with the fear of divine punishment woven into every sermon and festival, she may have slipped into a trance in which her body did exactly what the culture had primed it to do. It danced, not for fun, not for an audience, but as an automatic driven performance of the very thing she dreaded, the curse of St. Vitus. From the outside, it looked like a spectacle. From the inside, it may have felt like compulsion, like being seized by something greater than herself. Now the template existed, not just in stories, but in flesh. People saw her, they heard rumours. A woman has been taken by the dance. They knew the scriptures, the miracle tales, the whispered stories of earlier dancing frenzies along the Rhine, and in minds already frayed by hunger and debt collectors and talk of God's wrath, a powerful circuit closed. This is what happens when the curse falls. In that circuit, mass psychogenic illness finds a perfect fuel. We know, from many other times and places, that such outbreaks thrive when 3 conditions line up: intense, shared stress, a plausible cultural script for what bodily disaster looks like, and a public, emotionally charged first case. In 1962, in what is now Tanzania, a small group of schoolgirls began laughing. The laughter wasn't ordinary. It went on and on, spilling out of the usual limits of amusement. It was exhausting, distressing, unstoppable. Soon, more girls in the school began to laugh in the same uncontrollable way. The episode persisted for months, jumping from one school to another, eventually affecting hundreds of people. There was no toxic gas in the classroom, no mysterious pathogen in the water. There was, however, enormous stress, a newly independent nation, strict missionary schooling, tight discipline, and adolescent anxieties with little safe outlet. The outbreak became known as the Tanganyika laughter epidemic, and it is now one of the clearest modern examples of mass psychogenic illness, taking a distinctly performative shape. A movement, a sound, a behaviour repeated and amplified across a community. In other places the shape has been different. Fainting epidemics in factories, where workers collapse one after another after rumours of a contaminant spread. Clusters of young people in the same town developing tics and jerking movements, diagnosed as conversion disorder, a condition where psychological conflict is expressed as real neurological symptoms. In each case, the body chooses a language that makes sense locally. Laughter in a schoolyard, fainting in a factory where toxic exposure is feared, twitching and tics in a media-saturated world where movement disorders are vividly present on screens. Strasbourg in 1518 possessed its own dictionary of bodily disaster. There, uncontrolled dancing was already a known sign, rooted in collective imagination, that one had fallen under a saint's displeasure. People believed, with deep sincerity, that such a curse could take hold of their limbs. Paintings and sculptures showed tormented dancers. Pilgrimages promised relief. So when tension reached its breaking point, and one woman's body began to trace that feared pattern in the dust of a city street, others, without lying, without performing in the shallow sense, found their own bodies following, not freely, not joyfully, but under the same kind of involuntary drive we see in modern psychogenic outbreaks, where victims often insist, bewildered, "I can't help it. My legs just go. My chest just tightens. It just happens." Waller's central claim is that Strasbourg's dancers were caught in a collective trance, a web of expectation, fear, and neurological susceptibility that made the dance as real and as physically exhausting as any toxin could have done. Their hearts pounded, their muscles burned, some collapsed, injured or dead. And as with ergotism, you can imagine lower-level contributions from malnutrition, from minor illnesses, from bad air. Bodies worn thin are easier for the mind to commandeer. But the driving engine in this view is belief under pressure. This theory does not answer every question. It cannot reconstruct in perfect detail what any one dancer saw or felt. It relies on analogies to later, better documented episodes. It draws on medical concepts, dissociation, conversion, psychogenic illness, that were not named for centuries after the plague itself. Yet for many historians and physicians it currently fits the evidence more snugly than fungal toxins or exotic infections. It explains why the behaviour spread along lines of sight and rumour rather than evenly through the population. It accounts for the way the affliction mirrored a pre-existing religious script rather than random convulsions. It makes sense of the selective vulnerability, why some broke into dance while others, sharing the same bread, did not. Most importantly, it reminds us that minds, especially minds joined together in a culture of shared stories, can be as powerful as any chemical agent in shaping what bodies do. In Strasbourg, in that relentless summer, the power of belief did not stay politely in the realm of thoughts and prayers. It spilled into streets, into muscle memory, into the pounding of bare feet on hot stones. The curse, if there was one, did not have to come from a saint. It could rise from within, from imaginations trained from childhood to expect that, in times of great sin and suffering, bodies might begin to dance themselves toward ruin. And yet even this most persuasive modern account leaves space at the edges, space for other factors, space for questions we may never fully answer. To explore those, you have to turn to the smaller, stranger theories that have gathered, like onlookers at the edge of the square, around the dancers of 1518. Not everyone is satisfied with a story that begins and ends in the mind. For as long as people have tried to explain the Strasbourg dancers, other possibilities have hovered nearby, half in shadow, half in light, offering different ways to read the same frantic footsteps. One of the oldest alternative ideas is that at least some of the dancing was not an illness at all, it was a choice. Not a simple, casual choice like deciding to waltz at a festival, but a deliberate ritual act in a world where the boundary between protest, worship and despair was dangerously thin. Imagine for a moment that beneath the language of plague and curse, there is something more like a movement. We know that in late medieval Europe, people sometimes used public displays of piety as a kind of shield and a kind of weapon. Flagellants marched through towns whipping themselves, demanding repentance from corrupt authorities. Processions, vigils, and walks to shrines could carry quiet undercurrents of anger and demand. Some historians have wondered whether the dancers of 1518, consciously or not, were using the language of St. Vitus to say something their mouths could not safely speak. To the city council that had failed to feed them, to the wealthy who hoarded grain, to church officials who preached charity and practiced usury. If you live in a society where open rebellion is treason, and where the only legitimate way to gather in the streets is for worship, then worship itself can become a kind of protest. A line of bodies, moving in defiance of ordinary work rhythms, refusing to return quietly to fields and looms, might serve as a visible accusation, Look what your world has done to us. Look how broken things have become. In this reading, some of the dancers might not have been victims seized against their will, but participants in a ritualized form of complaint, perhaps begun in sincerity, then overtaken by genuine trance, then folded back into the official story as a plague, once the authorities decided it was a problem to be managed. There is no direct document that says the dancers were protesting. Medieval chroniclers rarely spoke that plainly about popular resistance, but the possibility lingers, a reminder that ritual and rebellion often share a stage. From there, the theories get stranger. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, a few scholars proposed that behind the dancers lay secret sects, fringe religious groups that practiced ecstatic movement as a path to God. They imagined half-hidden brotherhoods and sisterhoods moving along the Rhine, remnants of older, perhaps even pre-Christian traditions. Groups who believed that to whirl, to stamp, to move until the self dissolved, was to touch the divine. We know that Europe did harbour unusual religious movements, the Brethren of the Free Spirit, the flagellant confraternities, groups accused of heresy for claiming direct contact with God outside the Church's control, and there are modern analogues in other cultures. Sufi orders that spin in controlled whirl, Pentecostal congregations that sway and fall under what they experience as the Holy Spirit, Afro-Atlantic religions where drumming and dance open the way to spirit possession. So some have wondered, could Strasbourg's outbreak be a distorted echo of such a group? A ritual that spilled out of its usual boundaries, or was deliberately carried out in public, then later recorded by hostile observers as plague, madness, curse. The evidence here is thin, more atmospheric than solid. We have no membership lists, no manifestos. But hints of association between St. Vitus cults and marginal religious practices have led a few authors to sketch a picture of quasi-organised ecstatic fellowships, forever just out of reach in the records. Perhaps they suggest not everyone in that crowd was equally bewildered. Perhaps a core of dancers knew exactly what they were doing, even as others were swept along by fear and suggestion. Then there is the most sceptical line of thought of all, that nothing in Strasbourg was quite as big or as mysterious as later storytellers made it. In this view, there was some unusual dancing, to be sure, perhaps a dozen people at once, perhaps a few dozen, scattered over weeks, perhaps a handful of genuine medical cases. But medieval chroniclers loved a marvel. Numbers swelled in the telling. Dozens became hundreds. Hearsay became fact. A local episode, vivid but limited, was polished into a legend of an entire town swept away. When you read the sources closely, you do notice gaps. No citywide mortality spike carefully recorded in the tax rolls. No detailed list of names of the dead. Accounts written decades later that rely on earlier reports we no longer possess. It is possible, some would say likely, that the scale of the outbreak has been exaggerated. Over time, the story of some people dancing in distress for days can easily harden into scores dancing to their deaths, especially when retold by pamphleteers, preachers, and centuries later by modern writers eager for a dramatic hook. That does not mean there was no real suffering. It does suggest that part of what we are dealing with is also the history of how stories grow. Alongside these social and narrative explanations sits a quieter, clinical line of inquiry. What about the brains and nerves of the dancers themselves? Even within a framework of mass psychogenic illness, individual bodies can have their own vulnerabilities. Neurologists have noted that some descriptions of jerking, twisting, and uncoordinated movements in medieval dancing manias sound less like smooth, rhythmical dancing and more like chorea, a pattern of rapid, involuntary movements seen in conditions such as Sydenham's chorea, which can follow streptococcal infections. Others have suggested that certain dancers might have had forms of epilepsy, especially temporal lobe epilepsy, which can produce trance states, automatisms, and a sense of being driven by external forces. Encephalitis, inflammation of the brain, can also cause behavioural changes, agitation, and abnormal movements. In the 20th century, the mysterious encephalitis lethargica produced in some sufferers episodes of compulsive motion and post-encephalitic Parkinsonism. Looking backward, it is tempting to see scattered predecessors through history. Perhaps then, a few individuals in Strasbourg had genuine neurological disorders. Their movements, frightening and hard to interpret, might have provided vivid models for others to imitate unconsciously, or to project their fears upon. Add to that malnutrition, minor fevers, and the general wear and tear of poverty, and you get nervous systems already running close to the edge, more likely to tip into seizure or collapse under pressure. This brings us back to a simple but important point. No single theory, on its own, feels large enough to hold everything that is reported about 1518. Ergotism explains convulsions, but not the selective spread along lines of sight. Mass psychogenic illness fits the pattern of cultural scripts and stress, but leaves room for outliers whose symptoms seem more purely neurological. Ritual protest and secret sects make sense of the social context, but rest on fragile documentation. Skeptical talk of exaggeration reminds us to be cautious, yet cannot erase the multiple independent references to something undeniably strange happening that summer in Strasbourg. Most likely the truth is a tangle, a handful of people with genuine brain disorders, a larger group whose minds, shaped by fear of St. Vitus and crushed by hunger, translated stress into motion, a social world where ritual and rebellion were never far apart, and over it all, a layer of narrative inflation, as each retelling chose the most dramatic details and let the rest fall away. This, perhaps, is why the dancing plague continues to haunt imagination. It sits where so many human questions meet. Medicine, religion, psychology, power, storytelling. It asks how far belief can reach into flesh, how communities handle suffering they cannot neatly classify, how authorities respond when bodies begin to misbehave in public. It reminds us that even in an age before brain scans and lab tests, people experienced very real collisions between mind and body, faith and fear, that do not fit easily into one modern box. And as you follow the trail of theories, from fungus to protest, from secret cults to slipping neurons, you begin to see that the mystery of Strasbourg is not just about why they danced. It is about what their dancing reveals, uncomfortably, about us. If you stay with Strasbourg long enough, past the medical hypotheses and the archival doubts, it starts to feel less like a historical puzzle and more like a mirror. Because whatever else 1518 was, it is one of the clearest windows we have into how tightly the human mind and body are braided together. Especially when life becomes unbearable. Picture those streets again. Cobblestones already hot by mid-morning, the air thick with the sour smell of too many people and too little food, tax collectors moving door to door, sermons about sin and punishment echoing from stone churches, rumours about comets, eclipses and signs in the sky drifting like smoke through taverns and market stalls. Inside each body, hunger, fatigue, old injuries. Inside each mind, debts, griefs, private shames, half-spoken fears about what God or the saints might do if pushed too far. We like to pretend that the mind sits above all this, a kind of detached manager issuing rational commands. Strasbourg suggests something different, that, under enough pressure, the mind can stop being a manager and become a conduit, a channel through which the weight of a whole society pours straight into muscle and nerve. In 1518, that pressure found an outlet in motion, toes blistering, knees swelling, hearts hammering. People danced not because they misunderstood what was happening to them, but because their bodies were doing the only thing that made sense inside a story they had been told since childhood. This is where the second lesson of Strasbourg comes into focus. Culture does not just shape what we believe, it shapes how we get sick. In a world soaked in the cult of St. Vitus, where children were warned that a single blasphemous gesture could earn you a curse of involuntary dance, certain paths were already laid down in people's imaginations. You feared a particular punishment. You heard stories about others who had suffered it. You saw paintings, heard sermons, watched processions invoking the same saint. So when panic and stress and hunger finally overwhelmed your ability to cope, your body reached for the script it knew. You did not wake up and think, I will now express my despair as a culturally patterned conversion disorder. You simply began to move, and the meaning followed. If Strasbourg had happened in another time and place, the script might have been different. In 17th-century Salem, similar tensions helped produce accusations of witchcraft and fits interpreted as demonic torment. In 19th-century Europe, young women in convents and boarding schools developed epidemics of swooning, paralysis, and mutism that fit the language of hysteria rather than saintly curses. In the early 20th century, industrial workers sometimes experienced sudden blindness or limb weakness after accidents and near misses, symptoms that made sense within a world obsessed with nerves and trauma. The suffering in all these cases was real. The form it took was not random. It flowed along grooves carved by belief, by fear, by whatever the culture at that moment said was possible. We see the same pattern now, only the saints and demons have changed their costumes. In recent years, doctors have watched clusters of teenagers, linked not by villages and shrines but by social media feeds, develop sudden tics and involuntary vocalizations, movements that echo Tourette syndrome, but spread not through contaminated wells or shared bread, but through screens and algorithms. A girl in one country posts a video of her symptoms. Another girl, thousands of miles away but steeped in the same anxieties and expectations, begins to feel her own body jerk and twist. Before long, clinics see waves of similar cases, not faked, not consciously chosen, but organised by a new kind of shared narrative. There are also our quieter, more diffuse epidemics. Rising rates of anxiety and panic in societies that tell people they should be endlessly productive, endlessly visible, endlessly optimized. Workplaces where burnout expresses itself as chronic pain, digestive trouble, migraines, all the ways a body can say no more when a mind feels it cannot. In each instance, biology is there, doing what biology does. Neurons fire, stress hormones surge, muscles tighten, but the shapes those forces take, dancing in front of a shrine, tics on a TikTok video, chest tightness in an office cubicle, are guided by stories. Strasbourg makes that visible in a way that is hard to ignore. It also undercuts a comforting illusion that as individuals and as communities, we are basically reasonable, basically in control, and that only rare, exotic people in faraway superstitious times ever lost it on a mass scale. But when you strip away the distance of centuries, what you see in 1518 is something uncomfortably familiar. A city under economic strain, authorities more worried about order than about care, a population marinating in fear-based messages, no clear outlet for anger that wouldn't invite punishment. In such conditions, it does not take much to tip a system over. Sometimes that tipping point produces a riot or a revolution. Sometimes it produces a wave of suicides, or a run on the banks, or a sudden haunted certainty that a neighbouring group is plotting your destruction. Sometimes, in a corner of the early modern Holy Roman Empire, it produces a line of exhausted people, stamping their feet into the ground until they collapse. Under enough pressure, the thin layer of rational self-control we prize can tear in spectacular and strange ways. Not because people are weak, but because they are human, and human nervous systems were never designed to endure unlimited, unrelenting stress without some kind of response. When we look back at the dancers with this in mind, another temptation appears, to treat them as curiosities, to turn them into a Gothic spectacle. Imagine, we say to ourselves, safely removed, an entire town so deluded they dance themselves to death. But the closer you read the accounts, the harder it is to hold them at that distance. You start to notice small details, the mention of blood on the stones, of relatives trying to drag loved ones home and failing, of onlookers torn between horror and the faint, frightening tug of wanting to join in. Behind every anonymous dancer in the chronicles was a person with a name, with family, with a set of hopes and griefs that never made it onto the parchment. Maybe one was a mother already half shattered by losing children to the last bad harvest. Maybe one was a man whose debts had piled up beyond paying, whose dreams of guild membership had quietly died. Maybe one was a teenager, perched between obedience and rebellion, who stepped into the crowd because they could not bear one more day of being invisible. To them, whatever mixture of belief, panic, trance, and physiology was at work, the experience was not a metaphor. It was a prison. Their legs burned. Their hearts raced. They begged for it to stop. When it did not, the only explanation available was the one their world had prepared. A saint's anger. A curse fulfilled. A divine lesson written in cramps and contortions. If Strasbourg teaches anything, it is that when a community's surface finally cracks, what spills out are very real human beings, not symbols, and that the line between them and us is thinner than we like to think. There is one more thread running through the story, one we rarely name outright: trust. The dancing plague did not happen in a vacuum. It unfolded in a city where trust in institutions was already frayed. where the poor had little faith that the council would protect them, where religious comfort was mixed with threats of punishment, where neighbours watched one another warily, aware that a wrong word could mean trouble. In such a place, when fear hit, there were few safe shoulders to lean on. Imagine how differently the summer of 1518 might have gone if Strasbourg had been a city where grain was shared more fairly, where authorities were known to listen before they punished, where clergy preached less about wrath and more about compassion, where people believed deep down that when they broke they would be held. Perhaps there would still have been some unusual illness. Perhaps a few individuals would still have slipped into states we would now recognize as neurological or psychiatric. But would dozens, maybe hundreds, have been swept along? Would the movement have spread as easily from body to body, from mind to mind, if there had been stronger nets of care and less background terror? We cannot know. What we can say is that Strasbourg's ordeal points, quietly but insistently, toward the importance of what we now call collective mental health. Not just therapy rooms and diagnoses, but the everyday conditions that determine whether people feel basically safe in their world. Do they have enough to eat? Do they trust the people who govern them? Do they have ways to express anger and grief that do not require disguising it as madness, or miracle, or curse? When those foundations erode, bodies start to speak for us in ways we cannot easily predict or control. The dancers of 1518 did not choose their script. They inherited it. They lived in a world that gave them St. Vitus and curses instead of trauma and stress responses. We live in a world that gives us brain chemistry and algorithms and economic anxiety. Different vocabulary, same underlying fragility. Seen from this angle, the strange procession through Strasbourg streets is not just a medieval oddity. It is a warning and a plea. A warning that no society is so advanced, so rational, that it cannot find itself suddenly watching its own citizens do things that seem inexplicable, even to themselves. And a plea to build worlds, in our cities, our schools, our workplaces, our online spaces, where people have other options when the weight becomes too much. Places where fear does not have to borrow the language of plague, or saintly wrath, or uncontrollable motion to be heard. Because if the dancing plague tells us anything about being human, it is this: our bodies will find a way to express what our minds cannot bear to say aloud. The only question is whether anyone will be listening before the dance begins. By late summer, the music in Strasbourg had faded. The guildhalls went back to arguing over taxes. The preachers found new sins to thunder against. Merchants returned to weighing grain and counting coins. Somewhere in the city records, a clerk underlined a final note about the dancing sickness, and then moved on to the next problem. The streets where feet once pounded day and night grew quiet again. We don't know what became of Frau Trophäa. The chronicles that so confidently name her at the beginning fall strangely silent about her at the end. She slips back into the crowd, her brief, terrible prominence swallowed up by the anonymity of history. Maybe she recovered fully, her body finally still, her name never again worth writing down. Maybe she limped for the rest of her life, a private reminder of a summer when her legs stopped belonging to her. Maybe, when rumours later drifted through the city about other strange events in other places, she listened a little more closely than most. However her story ended, the city went on. Children were born who had not seen the dancers, only heard older relatives speak of that year. In low voices, craftsmen repaired the same cobbles that had been darkened with blood. New troubles arrived, fresh crop failures, new edicts, different fears. The dancing plague became what so many human disasters become once they are over, a story. And yet, if you follow that story carefully, from a single woman stepping into the street to dozens, then hundreds, and finally back down to silence, a pattern emerges, a real event witnessed, recorded, argued over, born from an extraordinary tangle of hunger and heat, terror and theology, rumour and ritual, shaped at every turn by what people believed the body could do, what they believed the saints might demand, what they believed God might permit. It didn't happen because medieval people were uniquely fragile or foolish. It happened because they were exquisitely responsive to the world they lived in, just as we are to ours. Tonight, as you lie there listening, some part of your own nervous system is doing something similar, taking in the pressures of your time, its expectations, its worries, its invisible storms, and deciding quietly how your body will carry them. Most of the time, That dance is too small to see, a shift in breathing, a clenched jaw, a heart that beats a little faster than it needs to when the phone lights up. Every once in a very long while, in a city like Strasbourg, it spills into the open and becomes something no one can ignore. If this journey through 1518 has kept you company, helped your thoughts slow down, or given you a different way to think about your own restless nights, you can help this little community grow. You can tap like or leave a comment. Maybe tell us where in the world you're listening from and what the night looks like outside your window. You can subscribe so the next story is waiting for you the next time you can't quite sleep, and share this with someone else who might need a softer kind of history. And if your curiosity is still awake, even as your body gets heavier, there's more to explore beyond this one strange summer. At sleepytimehistory.com there's a Sleepy Time History book waiting. A slow, deep wander through prehistoric secrets, through the long ages before cities and saints and cobblestones. It's written to be read the way you're listening now, gently at the edge of sleep, letting vast stretches of time wash over you until your own worries feel a little smaller. In the end, Strasbourg's dancers are not just figures in an old chronicle. They're reminders that every age has its breaking points, and every person has a story written partly in muscle and nerve, partly in fear and hope. Their feet have long since stilled. The dust they kicked up has settled, but the questions they raise about how we carry stress, how we shape one another's suffering, how belief can both wound and mend, keep moving quietly through us. As you drift towards sleep, you can let those questions soften rather than sharpen. The city is far away now. The cobblestones are cool, the crowds have gone home. Somewhere, the last echo of a long-ago footstep fades into the night air, and you're left with your own breathing, your own heartbeat, your own body choosing in this moment to rest instead of dance. Let the story close its eyes. Let your thoughts grow slower and softer and fewer. And when morning comes, the streets of your own life will still be there, waiting, a little more familiar now perhaps, for having once walked, in imagination, beside Frau Troffea and the dancers of 1518, and having learned that even the strangest steps are, at their core, deeply recognisably human. For now, there is nothing you have to do. The dance is over. You can sleep.